Hi there, IB History Year 2 students. This is video lesson number 3 for our unit on the Second World War, and the focus is on how new technologies transformed naval combat, naval warfare during the Second World War. And I want to start out with submarines, and particularly anti-submarine warfare, because if you remember, during the First World War, submarines caused real problems. It was very difficult to combat submarines. The only hope was to catch them when they surfaced. Now, if you could catch a submarine when it surfaced, you could blast it with your guns, and submarines were pretty vulnerable to that because they didn't carry heavy armor. They couldn't, because it would make it too difficult for the submarine to dive and surface, especially to surface if it was too laden with thick armor. And of course, a submarine wasn't supposed to have to defend itself with thick armor because it was traveling submerged. Being submerged underwater was supposed to protect submarines. And so during the First World War, submarines kind of had free reign of the oceans. During the Second World War, that began to change as more effective methods at detecting and combating submarines came online. So, first of all, in the area of detection, you saw the advent of what was called sonar, which is like radar. Radar, radio detection and ranging. Sonar, sound navigation and ranging. And it works effectively the same way, except instead of broadcasting radio waves out into the air and waiting for them to bounce off something solid and come back to you, with sonar, you're broadcasting sound waves into the water and waiting for them to bounce off something solid and come back to you. And so ships using sonar would emit repeated pulses of sound into the water. And then once again, you could measure the time and detect the direction from which they return after bouncing off a hard surface, like a submerged submarine. And by doing this repeatedly and then charting the sonar echoes, users could track a submarine's location, its direction, and its speed, just like you could do with airplanes and radar. Now, once you had a sense of where a submarine was, now you could begin to work on defending against it. And one option was to use destroyers. Now, destroyers were ships that were small and fast, and they were armed with sonar and depth charges. And so a depth charge was an explosive that was rigged with a depth meter, a pressure meter. And so as the depth charge was released into the water and it sank, and the pressure of the water registered at a certain level, a certain depth for which the depth charge was set, it would explode. It would explode underwater. And if you could drop a depth charge and have it explode close to a submarine, you could disable or even rupture the hull of a submarine and make it sink. And so, destroyers oftentimes escorted other ships, and they formed a sort of a protective ring around the other ships. And they were constantly searching, constantly using their sonar to search for enemy submarines. And if they detected an enemy submarine, the destroyer would race to the location where sonar indicated the submarine was. They would set their depth charge pressure meters to explode at the depth where sonar indicated that the submarine was, and then they would drop depth charges and hopefully damage the submarine or sink it, force it to the surface and capture it, rupture its hull and sink it, or otherwise disable it. But air power also played a really important role in anti-submarine warfare. Specially equipped planes searched for submarines from above because you could oftentimes see submarines lurking underneath the surface of the water if you viewed them from above. So anti-submarine aircraft flew missions over the Atlantic, for example, during what was known as the Battle of the Atlantic. And these anti-submarine aircraft also carried depth charges, and they could drop depth charges from above. So the the Battle of the Atlantic was what it sounds like. It was the battle for control of the Atlantic, which was extremely important during World War II because, especially once the United States became involved in supplying Britain and then the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease aid. The United States, by World War II, was by far the world's leading manufacturer of everything. The world's leading manufacturer, period, the world's leading industrialized nation. And President Roosevelt had pledged to make the United States the arsenal of democracy, even before the United States became formally involved in the war. You had the Lend-Lease Act, which was underway for months before the United States joined the war. And the thing was that you could generate all this war material, you could produce all this war material, but if you could not deliver it across the Atlantic because of German submarines, it wouldn't do you any good. And so the battle for the Atlantic, and then of course once the United States joined the war, it was also American soldiers who were being transported across the Atlantic. But the Battle of the Atlantic then was the battle for control, a battle between really the US Navy and the Royal Navy on the one hand, and then the German Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and particularly its submarine corps on the other hand. And and you'll see that at the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans certainly had the upper hand. Now, unfortunately, this isn't so easy to see. This is an old Battle of the Atlantic map that I was using, and I had these on overhead transparencies, and then you could see them a lot better. I've never been able to find a map equal to this, so I simply had to put them in the scanner and sort of do the best we've got. So here you can see the United States, and here you can see the British Isles. Here's the Atlantic, and then these are the major shipping routes between the United States and Britain. And the black dots indicate Allied ships, mostly cargo ships, transport ships, sunk by German submarines. The black dots indicate that. The red dots, to the extent that you can see them, represent German submarines sunk by Allied Navy. And you can see that at the beginning, in that first 6 months of the Battle of the Atlantic, from January, formally anyway, from January to July of 1942, the Germans absolutely had the upper hand. As a matter of fact, the Germans were so unafraid of American anti submarine capabilities that they were sinking Allied cargo ships right up on the coast of the United States. In fact, the great mass of Allied cargo ships that were being sunk right along the US coast. German submarines and submarine captains were absolutely unafraid. There was one German submarine captain who, after the war, claimed that he had brought his submarine all the way up into Charleston, South Carolina harbor and had put up his periscope, and that he could read through his periscope the headlines on the Charleston Mercury newspaper as people sitting on the Battery, which is the harborfront park, sitting on park benches reading the newspaper, were reading it. He could read the headlines. And there were many instances where Allied merchant ships, transport ships, were sunk within clear view of the coast. People, without using binoculars or using telescopes or any kind of aided viewing, could see burning Allied ships off the coast after being torpedoed by German submarines, which is very demoralizing. Part of the problem was that at the beginning of the war, of course, all of the major ports are associated with big cities. And big cities have a lot of electric lights, even back then, even 80 years ago. Big cities were lit up with electric lights. And as a result of that, Allied ships going out of port even at nighttime were silhouetted against the the lights of the city. And so that made them easy targets for German submarines. And so one of the important steps in combating uh, German submarine warfare in the Atlantic was to black out all of the major cities, to get people to hang blackout curtains, sort of opaque curtains in their windows, so that the lights from inside their buildings, office buildings, residential buildings, did not shine out into the harbor and silhouette the transport ships that were leaving. And that made it harder, more difficult for German submarines to target them. But as you can see, at the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies were clearly losing. German submarines were doing enormous damage to Allied shipping right within the coastal waters of the United States. Now, during the second year of the Battle of the Atlantic, things began to shift a little bit. Things began to get better. This map shows August of 1942 through May of 1943, and you can see two major changes. Number one, you don't have so many Allied transport ships being sunk right on the coast of the United States. This was due to things like blackout curtains and better patrols by the U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Navy off the coast of the United States. You can see instead that the bulk of Allied cargo ships that were lost out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in what was called the Greenland Air Gap. And it was called the Greenland Air Gap because anti-submarine aircraft flying out of Newfoundland here, out of Iceland here, and out of Britain here could scour the area for German submarines. And so you can see this circle represents the range of anti-submarine aircraft flying out of St. John's, New Brunswick. This circle represents the range of anti-submarine aircraft flying out of Reykjavik. This circle represents the range of anti-submarine aircraft flying out of Britain. And there's a gap in the middle of the Atlantic. There's what was called an air gap, a gap in coverage. And you can see that's essentially where most of the submarines were now having success sinking Allied cargo ships. But the number of Allied cargo ships being sunk is greatly reduced. On the other hand, the number of red dots, the number of German submarines being sunk, has significantly increased. And a lot of those are being sunk in those areas where the anti-submarine aircraft were on patrol. Then, in the last 2 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, from June 1943 through May of 1945, you can see that the tide has completely turned. Very, very few Allied cargo ships were sunk during those last 2 years. Even down here, where before the Germans were having more success, you can see here along the coast of South America, ships moving out of South America carrying food supplies and things like that. But in the last 2 years, even the South American coast is cleared out. There's increased numbers of Allied ships being sunk along the coast of France, because of course the invasion of France took place in June of 1944, halfway through this 2 year time period. And so a lot more Allied shipping was focused here. But significantly, the number of red dots is sort of overwhelming. You see that in the last 2 years of the war, more German submarines were actually being sunk than Allied merchant ships, Allied transport ships. And as a matter of fact, over the course of the war, as the Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies, over the course of the war, German submariners had the highest mortality rate of any classification of soldiers or sailors in the war, higher than Soviet infantrymen, for example, higher than Allied bomber crews. Although Allied bomber crews, if I remember, had the second highest mortality rate, but German submariners by far had the highest likelihood of being killed in action during the war. And air power changed the nature of naval warfare, not just in its role as an anti-submarine function, But it changed naval warfare in a much bigger and more fundamental way. Keep in mind that prior to this war, and since the inception of gunpowder, generally speaking, the way that naval combat took place was that ships from opposing fleets fired projectiles at each other from cannon that were mounted on board the ship. So, if you go far enough back into the early years of the age of gunpowder, you think about uh, big wooden ships with sails and rows of cannon mounted along the sides of the ships, and the ships maneuvering, trying to outmaneuver each other to get a good shot because you had to turn the entire ship really to aim your cannon. But then eventually, those cannon, as you see here, came to be they increased in range, they increased in accuracy, and they came to be mounted on rotating turrets, mounted on board the decks of ships. And the era of the battleship sort of took over in naval warfare. Um, and yet it was the same principle. They were still blasting projectiles at each other. And so naval battles were fought between fleets that were in relatively close quarters. They had to be within range of their cannons in order to do battle. And so um, the the distance between opposing fleets was measured in numbers of miles counted on one or two hands, uh, 1 mile apart, or no more than 10 miles apart. During World War II, however, all this changed because during World War II, the battleship, with its big rotating turrets and its giant guns, was replaced by the aircraft carrier as the most important ship in the fleet. Um, Certainly, we mentioned how at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese destroyed or heavily damaged every American battleship, but the four American aircraft carriers were not present in the harbor that day, and that represented a major failure of Japanese intelligence. And by intelligence, I mean information gathering. The Japanese certainly would have been better off if they had waited until the aircraft carriers were in the harbor. And the reason why is that in this war, aircraft carriers were going to be much more important than battleships in naval combat. And so during this war, aircraft carriers launched airplanes off their decks. And these airplanes then searched for the enemy fleet. And when they found them, they attacked them, dropping bombs or launching torpedoes. And essentially, that's how naval combat changed during the war. It was really much more about um, air power. It was much more about ships launching airplanes to attack each other. The damage that was done in battles was done by airplanes much more than by ships blasting away at each other. And so you say, well, then what was the function of all the other ships in the Navy? And essentially, the other ships in the Navy came to be sort of a protection for the aircraft carriers. They essentially were transformed into huge floating anti-aircraft platforms, and they surrounded the aircraft carriers to protect them from incoming airplanes. And so aircraft carriers didn't travel alone, they traveled in what became known as a task force or a carrier group. Now, this one, you can see one, two, three, four, five aircraft carriers at the center of this carrier group, but it's then surrounded by all the other ships. And the other ships, some of them are there to support the carriers. So they're tankers that carry fuel because these ships all were diesel powered, diesel engines. Or they might be tenders that carried supplies. But a lot of these ships were warships. These were converted battleships and heavy cruisers. And essentially, they were giant floating anti-aircraft platforms to try to shoot down enemy planes that were trying to get at the aircraft carriers. And then usually there was a screen of destroyers circling the task force in order to protect um, in order to protect from submarines. But now, in battle, the ships of opposing fleets, that is in World War II, oftentimes they did not make visual contact with each other anymore. Whereas before they were within a few miles of each other, now they could be 100 miles apart and doing battle through their airplanes. And this was especially true in the Pacific, where so much of the combat was of a naval combat nature. And of course, the Pacific is so vast, but it applied in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean as well. And and so the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first battle in history in which the two fleets never made visual contact. And we'll come to that battle in a moment. But what I wanted to do real quickly here is show you the two kinds of attack planes. One was a torpedo attack plane, and you see that this plane carried a torpedo under its belly. And this plane sort of flew in low over the surface of the water. And when it targeted enemy ship, it would drop the torpedo into the water, the torpedo's motor would start, and the motor would carry the torpedo toward the enemy ship and strike it. The other was a dive bomber, which carried a single bomb underneath its belly. The dive bomber would start from a very high altitude and dive at a very sharp angle right on top of the target, and then release its bomb at the last minute. And the dive bomber pilot then would hopefully pull out of the dive and escape. The torpedo attack plane represented somewhat less risk to its crew, because you could drop a torpedo in several hundred feet out from the target, and then the torpedo sort of did the rest of the work. And so you didn't have to penetrate as far into that cloud of anti-aircraft fire that all the other ships were putting up. But on the other hand, it was less likely to hit its target, especially the farther out you drop the torpedo in, because the target was a moving target and you're shooting a torpedo from quite a distance, you're less likely to hit your target. So although it was safer for the crew of the plane, it was less likely to hit the target. A dive bomber was much more likely to hit the target because you were diving right on top of it and releasing the bomb at the last minute. But of course, that was much more dangerous, much more risky to the pilot. But naval warfare was extremely important in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was extremely important in determining the outcome of the war. It was the turning point in the Pacific, when planes from American aircraft carriers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which, due to Japan's lack of mineral resources, were irreplaceable. And so were the skilled Japanese fighter pilots who were killed. And then, as the war progressed, on the other hand, the Japanese began using the airplanes themselves as bombs in what was called kamikaze attacks, where suicide pilots loaded up their aircraft with bombs and dove directly onto Allied shipping. At the Battle of Okinawa, 36 Allied ships were sunk. Over 500 hits from kamikaze planes were recorded against Allied shipping. So you really get the idea. This was a new kind of naval warfare, and it was playing out especially in the Pacific, and it resulted in extremely impactful battles. And also, American and British naval dominance in the Pacific, once it was achieved, played a huge role in simply choking off Japan's supply of war materials. Japan, which had very few natural resources of its own, relied on materials that were imported from its empire. And once the Allied navies got a chokehold on Japan, Allied submarines and air power began to sink Japanese transport ships. Japan's war effort began to falter very heavily. So back to that Battle of the Coral Sea. When we last talked about the Japanese, they had won every battle they had fought in the Pacific, and really during the first 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor and all of the other attacks that had taken place in that 36-hour period after Pearl Harbor. We talked about how the Japanese had won every battle they fought. Neither the Americans nor the British seemed to have an answer for them. The Japanese captured all of the American possessions in the Western Pacific: Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines. You remember the Bataan Death March. They captured all of the British possessions in the Western Pacific, including Hong Kong and Malaya. And they also conquered the Dutch East Indies. And really, there were 300,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean that were now under the control of the Japanese Navy. And the Japanese now planned to try to invade Australia because it was seen that if the Allies were going to try to recapture these islands that the Japanese had taken in those first 6 months when no one seemed to be able to stop them, Australia would be the base from which the Allies would launch that attempt. And so the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought here off the coast of Australia. The Japanese fleet approached with 2 aircraft carriers. They actually had 8 total carriers in the Pacific, so they had not committed the majority of them to this battle. The Americans countered with 2 of our own. We only had 4. The Japanese started the war with 8 aircraft carriers, the United States with 4. And so the Americans had basically divided their Navy, their Pacific Fleet, into 2 groups. One to sort of protect the Northern Pacific against a thrust toward Midway or Hawaii. The other 2 to protect the South Pacific, to protect against a Japanese thrust toward Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea was essentially a draw. Each side lost one of their aircraft carriers. The Americans sunk 1 Japanese aircraft carrier. The Japanese sunk 1 American, though the other American aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown, was heavily damaged and was rushed back to Pearl Harbor and put into repair mode, and was actually restored to battle readiness in record time, like less than a month's time. But despite losing sort of 1.5 aircraft carriers, the Americans sank 1 large Japanese aircraft carrier and a smaller one. And more importantly, it was a strategic victory for the United States. They prevented the Japanese from opening up the sea lanes around Australia, which would have allowed them to invade Australia. And it was the first time that the Japanese had not won a battle. It was the first time that a Japanese operation had not achieved its strategic objective. So it was kind of the end of Japan's winning streak. It wasn't a clear Allied victory either, but it wasn't a Japanese victory. But the battle holds a much more significant place in the overall history of naval warfare, because as mentioned before, it was the first fully air-sea battle in history. That is, it was the first time that an entire naval battle had been fought without the 2 fleets ever making, ships from the 2 fleets ever making visual contact, all the damage having been done by aircraft launched from their aircraft carriers. So that wraps it up. It gives you a little window into how naval combat was changed. So you've seen how combat on land was transformed from World War I to World War II. World War I being much more reliant on that static trench warfare. World War II being much more mobile and mechanized. That is in the Blitzkrieg, to where static fortifications proved almost useless. You've seen how air combat changed with the increasing use of bombing, both tactical bombing and strategic bombing, and the use of airborne assaults of paratroopers. And now you've seen how naval combat changed as well. And as we move forward, we'll look at how the major combatants mobilized human and economic resources in order to fight the war. And of course, we'll get back to the actual fighting. We'll talk about the battles some more as well. So until then, take care of yourselves. I hope you're able to keep healthy and safe, and I look forward to teaching you another lesson soon. Bye bye, IB History Year 2 students.